Let's open tonight with a figure central to our past. The medieval farmer, Europe's forgotten champion, supported the entire economic structure. This human subject endured every disease and shortage nature devised, usually without living through it. So before you relax, pause to like this video and subscribe. If you appreciate my content, tell me in the comments your location and current time. I find it compelling to discover our global audience. To genuinely experience a peasant's diet, begin your morning as they did by waking up and instantly feeling sorrow. Daybreak is announced by a rooster crowing, as if in agony, a noise created to make you remember that happiness is forbidden and rest is a prize you cannot have. You get up from a bed of straw, offering the comfort of a bag packed with sharp sticks and nine-time insects. Now, the first meal. You go to the fireplace, the heart of the home, and I mean it has a life of its own. This pot has been cooking since before your birth. It is an inherited burden. Each day, water is poured in to dilute the ancient thick mixture at the base. Contains anything the family didn't consume the previous day: cereals, legumes, tubers, and the odd unit and fightable piece that could be plant or animal. The cauldron is never emptied. Peasants didn't clean their cookware. They just kept heating it until the germs perished or became holy. The taste is intricate. Think of the flavor of despair. Think of heated dirt, but more aggressive. Think of eating something unfeeling. This has witnessed events. If fortune smiles, a carrot appears. Not for health, just for spirit. A vibrant spot of optimism in a dull expanse of misery. Then there's the loaf, a medieval specialty from rye grain, water, and sheer spite. Heady, dark, and able to ruin not just molars, but the will to live. Grinding was so crude that fragments of rock often baked into the bread. Well done, your meal now also serves as oral hazard. Next, the beverage. The young, the old, everyone consumes diluted ale, not for morning celebration, but because water was a bet with death. This ale was secure, slightly bubbly, and provided the slight intoxication needed to endure the primary breakfast flavor regret. No fresh produce, no poultry eggs, no dairy, unless it predates your childhood. You consume your gruel, moisten your rock minus like bread, and drink your ale, wondering if hunter minus gatherers had it better. That's the morning meal, a perfect introduction to the medieval day. Bland and stable, and soul minus crushing. But somehow you endure. If the morning gruel didn't defeat you, the bread would. Peasant bread was less a food and more a physical trial. Forget soft interiors, brown tops, or that warm scent that gives modern people faith. Its bread smelled faintly of soil, mold, and resignation. Consider the components. Peasants rarely had wheat, unless the nobleman lost some. Their loaves were rye, wheat stuff acrid, somewhat hostile relative. In bad years, rye was bulked with items unfit for bread, pulverized legumes, nuts, for spot weeds, and the least toxic plant available. Then there was stone dust, the unrecostued medieval condiment. Grain was crushed between rock wheels that shed fragments into the meal. Each loaf was a test for your molars, designed to grind them into dust. Researchers find skeletons with teeth worn smooth like stones. Congratulations, that was from your breakfast. This is why peasants didn't require dentists. Their bread was the dental appointment. Now, the field. Imagine a loaf so solid it could serve as a weapon in a fight. Bread wasn't cut, it was battled. Some peasants softened it in beer, others dunked it in gruel. A few brave souls tried to bite it dry and left parts of their teeth behind. The wealthy had airy white bread. The poorer had mezlin, a bleak mix of rye and floor sweepings. You didn't pick mezlin picked you. If luck was bad, the rye hosted ergot, a glowing fungus causing spasms, visions, and the sense that demons danced in your head. Whole villages sometimes hallucinated together, a medieval party with more terror. For the saddest part, bread was the staple. You didn't get a piece, you got a block, multiple blocks per day. So yes, peasants feared not hunger, but the act of eating. If medieval peasants had one steady pleasure, and that's a generous term, it was morning beer, not in a fun, social way. This was beer for survival, the kind you drink because the local water wants to kill you. Rivers carried animal waste. Rails hosted pathogens, rain barrels bred creatures that crawled out after dark. So peasants boiled everything, and boiling led to brewing. Hence weak ale, breakfast's safest, least deadly drink. Don't imagine peasants getting cheerful at sunrise and yelling insights across fields. This ale was very low in alcohol, just enough to be safe, not enough to be interesting. It tasted like the ghost of beer in tepid water, but it was wet. It wasn't lethal, and it sometimes hid the taste of your bread brick. Children drank it too. Yes, medieval infants had small cups of ale before they could talk. This explains their penmanship and life choices. It also explains why no one understood hydration or wellness. The brewing process was flexible. Each home had its own brewery, a charitable term for a clage or with questionable cleanliness. Yeast was not understood, but often offended. Grain quality changed. Water quality better not to ask. But the result was always the same, a liquid that didn't cause immediate illness. On holidays, ale was stronger. The good kind. The beer that made you forget your feudal lord. Thought washing was sorcery. But that wasn't breakfast beer. Breakfast beer was the boring sibling, plain, watery, and vaguely like bread. A liquid note that life is a long race of let-downs. In some regions, peasants drank small beer, even weaker, essentially barley minus flavored melancholy. But it maintained hydration, sustained life, and gave a slight buzz to tolerate 14 hours of unpaid farm work. So yes, before coffee, before juice, before morning habits, peasants woke, stretched, and drank beer like water, because it was. By mid-morning, the peasant had been awake for 5 or 6 hours, tilling soil, tending livestock, carrying water, and doubting their ancestors' decisions. Naturally, this is the perfect time for a snack, which meant something barely edible from your pocket. This wasn't a real meal. It was what you could find before the rooster finished ruining your day. No cheese board, no nuts, no fruit with a side of hope. Instead, your snack was usually one of 3 things. A raw onion. Yes, an onion, eaten like an apple. Tears on your face, not from the onion, but from your life. Peasants existed in a constant state of weeping and denial. A hard piece of cheese, but not good cheese. His cheese squeaked when cut and had the vibe of a discarded shoe. It was either very new and slippery, or very old and capable of damaging a cart. No one knew the cheese's age. No one asked. Asking questions was risky. In the Middle Ages, bread that defied laws. Leftover muslin bread from yesterday. Already hard enough to be a wecum. For a snack, you didn't slice it, you broke pieces off like a stone worker. It was mobile, long minus lasting, and could be used as emergency masonry. Sometimes for change peasants brought peas or fava beans, still run, stilled ismal. Occasionally, a lucky person had a bit of salted fish, chewed all day like the world's gloomiest energy bar. And don't forget the medieval worker's accessory, the food bag, a leather pouch smelling of regret, sweat, and generations of snacks. This snack didn't improve mood. It didn't renew strength. It just postponed the end. The goal wasn't enjoyment. The goal was to live long enough to eat more gruel later. Peasants rarely sat for this meal. They ate while moving, laboring, or digging. Medieval life was one long, unhealthy exercise session. So yes, the mid-morning snack wasn't a pause. It was a silent plea disguised as food. By lunch, the peasant had done what modern people call a full day's work. They had plowed, sown, carried, cut, shoveled, milked, sweated, and maybe wept when no one saw. Lunch was the prize for this effort, which would be great if the prize weren't gruel. Again, lunch in the Middle Ages wasn't a meal you anticipated. It was a meal you endured. You faced it like bad news or a taxman with quiet acceptance and the knowledge that fighting was useless. The midday gruel was the same as the mornings, just hotter and more bitter. The flavors hadn't gotten better. They'd just become more aware of their misery. You sat on the ground because chairs were for the rich and those with intact spines. Before you, a wooden bowl held as to so thick a spoon could stand in it. The ingredients were the same. Barley, beans, and any vegetables that grew that season. The only difference was the amount, just enough to keep you working, not enough to bring joy. If by chance there was meat, it was never a good cut. It was a thin piece of salt pork, preserved so well it could last an ice age. This meat wasn't soft. It wasn't moist. It was a test. You chewed it so long you wondered if it was ever alive. But peasants saw it as a delight, because compared to their usual food, this at least had a taste, even if that taste was salt and misery. Bread sometimes appeared at midday, though by now, it was even harder. The crust felt like a castle wall. Soaking it in gruel helped, but only like wetting a brick makes it slightly less brick-like. Lunch didn't revive you, it didn't energize you, it just stopped you from falling over in the field, which was the main point. After eating, you stood up with knees that sounded like old gates and went back to work, powered only by will and a digestive system made for hardship. Eating like a peasant meant living by the seasons, and the seasons were not kind. Each brought its own special culinary disappointment, a rotating selection of wilted food, and the constant worry that the harvest might just quit. Summer was, in theory, the good season. Crops were growing, animals were alive, and sunlight reminded you the world wasn't all glue. But even in summer, peasants didn't eat like royalty. They had peas, beans, leeks, and maybe a cabbage if pests hadn't feasted in the garden. Everything was fresh, yes, but fresh as in just pulled from the soil, still tasting of earth. Summer meals were green and very boring, but there was food. Then came autumn, a season peasants loved and dreaded. Harvest meant back minus breaking work, and it also meant the best meals of the year. Roots, fruits, nuts, fungi, and anything nature hadn't hidden well. The problem was storage. Peasants preserved food with salt, smoke, cellars, or hope. And hope, it turns out, doesn't stop mold. Many autumn foods were just summer ingredients that had given up. Winter was the real enemy of the medieval diet. Once frost came, your meals were a series of edible survival tricks. Salted fish, salted pork, salted everything. If it wasn't salted, it wasn't safe. Winter vegetables included turnips that tasted like sorrow and onions that could be used as weapons. Bread hardened, gruel thinned, hope faded. Yes, there were feast days, but one day of roast meat didn't compensate for 90 days of culinary despair. Finally spring, also called the hungry season. Winter stores were almost empty. New crops weren't ready. Animals were still thin. This was the season where peasants ate weeds. Not trendy for aged greens, but weeds. Whatever grew first became dinner, whether it was edible or felt like punishment. So yes, peasants sate with the seasons, but not by choice. Their seasonal menu was dictated by famine, cold, and the ongoing war between people and nature, a war nature often won. A peasant's vegetable patch was not a charming, picture-minus-perfect garden. There were no eat beds, no heritage tomatoes, no basil in cute pots. The peasant garden was a battlefield, a desperate fight between humans and nature, where nature usually won. This garden, if you could call it that, was a small fenced area of dirt with vegetables chosen not for taste, but for their ability to suffer. Medieval vegetables weren't picky. They grew in poor soil, under bad conditions, and tasted like it. Flavor wasn't the goal, survival was. The star was the turnip, not because anyone liked turnips. No one in history has ever truly liked a turnip, but because they were nearly unkillable. Drought, turnips lived. Frost, turnips lived. Hissing it with a stick, it probably lived. They were the insects of medieval produce. Next came leeks, the medieval version of seasoning, even though they tasted like sour dipped in onion. Peasants pretended leeks improved their meals, but mostly leeks just existed, lump and limp, waiting to be boiled to nothing. Cabbage also appeared often, usually as a large, watery head that smelled like it had ethical problems with being eaten. Beans and peas completed the garden, not the modern sweet kind, but the medieval ones that tasted like chuck and regret. They were filling though, which made them popular. Peasants didn't eat for pleasure. They ate to avoid starvation. Herbs, forget it. Herbs were luxuries grown in the Lord's garden by the Lord's gardener, using the Lord's soil and stolen peasant labor. If a commoner wanted flavor, they had two choices: salt, which was costly, or pretending their food had flavor. Usually they chose the second. Then came the pests. Rabbits, rats, bugs, birds, anything with a stomach. Medieval gardens were a buffet for every creature except the people who planted them. Half the harvest fed nature, the other half went into gruel untarnished, without improving the taste. Tending the garden required hours of bending, carrying, weeding, watering, and yelling at plants that refused to grow. That the reward, a handful of vegetables with the flavor of wet cardboard. Such was the medieval garden. A great effort producing very mediocre food. If you were a peasant, meat wasn't a food group. It was a rumor, something whispered about in winter, something you might taste monthly, if the gods were kind. Lest peasants ate so little meat that modern vegetarians would think they were trying too hard. First, the basics. The animals on your land belonged to the Lord. The deer in the forest, the Lord's. The rabbits in your garden, the Lord's. The boar breaking your fence, also the Lord's. If it breathed, walked on for legs, or could be cooked, it was legally his. Killing it without permission was poaching. Medieval for enjoy prison or trying ought to lose a hand. So peasants made do with what they could eat, which usually meant pork fat, salted pork scraps, or animal parts the rich didn't want. You didn't get chops. You got a piece of something questionable, preserved so heavily in salt it looked mummified. It wasn't tender, it wasn't juicy, it was a culinary challenge. Chicken? Rare. Chickens were valuable for eggs. Killing one early was like burning your savings. Beef? No. Cows were too valuable alive. Mutton only if a sheep died of foolishness, sickness, or spite. If you wanted fresh meat, you waited for slaughter season, a happy time in late autumn when animals were killed, because winter would kill them anyway. On that day, you might taste liver, kidneys, or heart. Peasants wasted nothing. If it wasn't a hoof or a sin, it was dinner. Fish, however, was allowed, mostly because fish were too slippery to belong to the Lord. Peasants ate eels, carp, and whatever else came from the river with a net and a prayer. But fish spoiled fast, so most was salted, until it resembled a chew toy. True feasts were for holy days when everyone ate real meat, sang and briefly forgot their digestive system was held together by gruel and will. But in daily life, meat was a rarity, a dream, a distant memory of something tasty that richer people enjoyed regularly. For the peasant, meat wasn't a meal. It was an event. If peasants had one reliable source of protein, calcium, and mild emotional damage, it was cheese. But don't think of golden cheddar or soft brie. No, peasant cheese was a different species. The kind of dairy that looked like it had a difficult history and wanted you to share it. Cheese began like most things in the medieval world from meat and bad storage. Milk spoiled quickly. Cows produced less in winter, and everything had to be preserved. So peasants curdled milk on purpose, pressed it, dried it, salted it, and prayed. The result was cheese, sort of. There were two main kinds, fresh and aged, both with serious flaws. Fresh cheese was soft, pale, and lumpy, the dairy version of a shrug. Its flavor was mild but suspicious, like something that wasn't dangerous yet, but could be with a strong wind or a hard look. Fresh cheese went bad faster than a medieval marriage, so peasants ate it quickly and nervously. Then there was aged cheese, hard cheese, cheese that had been on a shelf so long it had developed a personality. These wheels were ends sharp and could stop an arrow. If dropped, they dented a table. If thrown, they ended a feud. Some historians think ancient peasants survived winter, not because of hearty diets, but because their cheese was edible armor. But texture wasn't the only issue. Cleanliness varied. Milk pails weren't sterilized. They were wiped. Curing vats were rinsed. Molds grew where they wanted. Sometimes the cheese had too much personality, and peasants got around the part that looked conscious. Despite all this, cheese was a staple. It was portable filling, and easier to chew than bread, which for peasants was a miracle. A chunk of cheese could go with you into the fields, last a workday, and probably survive a minor disaster. Some lucky families also made whey soup, which was as unappetizing as it sounds. Leftover liquid from cheese minus making, warmed, salted, and eaten with the enthusiasm of someone accepting their fate. Still, cheese was respected. It was valuable. It kept you alive. And most importantly, it rarely fought back. When the garden failed, the animals weren't yours, and the cottage tasted like recycled agony. Peasants turned to the last option, foraging. A medieval practice also known was walking into the woods and hoping something doesn't kill you. Foraging was essential, dangerous, and unpredictable. Nature didn't care about your hunger. Nature had its own schedule, and your stomach wasn't on it. Yet every year, peasants wandered through forests, hedges, and river bents, looking for anything edible, or anything that looked edible if you squinted. The most common finds were berries. They're not the sweet kind modern people love. Medieval berries were smaller, sour, and more suspicious. You'd pick handfuls, staining your fingers purple like a crime scene, and hope they didn't have worms. If they did, peasants called it extra protein, which says everything about medieval nutrition. Then came nuts, the Nobel Prize of foraging, mostly hazelnuts and walnuts. These were precious, not just for eating, but for trading, storing, and sometimes throwing at your cousin. But gathering nuts was competitive. You weren't just fighting hunger, you were fighting squirrels. And squirrels, medieval or not, do not mess around. Herbs were also gathered. The peasants rarely knew what they were. Some leaves improved the flavor of gruel. Others sent you on a spiritual journey to meet God early. Medieval herb knowledge was guesswork with consequences. And then there were mushrooms, the medieval lottery. Some filled your belly, some filled your grave. Identifying mushrooms was a skill passed down through generations. But generational memory isn't perfect. Every so often, someone would confidently say, "This one is safe." And 3 hours later, the whole village would see colors that didn't exist yet. Roots like wild garlic and bok were prizes too. But digging them up felt like a lone budget archaeological dig. You'd scrape the dirt with whatever tool hadn't broken and pray the root wasn't just a rock pretending to be food. Foraging wasn't just about eating. It was about survival. Some years it saved entire villages. Other years it wiped out half the population when a fungus, berry, or mushroom decided it deserved revenge. But despite the dangers, peasants kept foraging, crawling through brambles, dodging animals, and eating whatever the forest grudgingly offered. Because when you're a medieval peasant, hunger isn't a feeling, it's a lifestyle. Dinner in the medieval peasant world was not a grand finale. It was not a moment of celebration or comfort. It was quite simply gruel round 2, the sequel no one asked for and everyone dreaded. Yet here it is again, bubbling in the same pot, waiting to greet you like an overfamiliar acquaintance who refuses to take hints. By evening the gruel has reached a new stage of existence. It has simmered all day, absorbing every vegetable scrap, every grain fragment, and every emotional breakdown that occurred in the kitchen. The texture is thicker now, a medieval concrete mix, and the flavor is somehow both stronger and weaker at the same time. It's a culinary paradox, dense but watery, bland, that overwhelming, edible, but emotionally damaging. Use it at the table, which is really just a plank of wood pretending to be furniture. Your bowl is carved from a single piece of timber, and probably still tastes faintly of tree. Everyone gets a ladle full of the gruel. The ladle lefuel is generous. It's more like someone scoops a chunk from the pot and hopes it slides into your bowl eventually. The contents vary depending on the day. Sometimes it's barley heavy, sometimes it's turnip heavy, sometimes it's just disappoint. The vegetables have been boiled so thoroughly that they no longer possess texture, color, or self-awareness. Everything becomes a beige slurry, a unified mess of edible confusion. If there is bread left over, and that's a big if, you dunk it into the gruel to soften it enough that your teeth survive. For a fleeting moment, this feels like luxury. Then the bread dissolves into the stew and the fantasy ends. Meat and dinner gruel is a rare miracle. Maybe a hint of pork fat. Maybe a bone that has been boiled so many times its ancestors feel tired. A bone in the pot is exciting though. A bone means the stew has seen meat, and that alone can boost morale. Dinner is silent, not because it's peaceful, but because talking wasted energy. The only sounds are the scraping of spoons and the distant groaning of someone's back as they shift on a stool that predates literacy. Once the bowls are empty, you don't feel full, just slightly less empty. Dinner does not satisfy hunger, it merely negotiates with it. But it's fuel, and tomorrow will demand more fuel, more gruel, more chewing, more survival. Such as the medieval dinner. In the life of a medieval peasant, there existed a sacred and deeply cherished event known as the feast day. Not because it happened often, it didn't, but because it was the one moment in the entire year when a peasant could experience something vaguely resembling happiness. Feasts were like medieval holidays mixed with medieval buffets, except instead of casinos or beaches, you had a churchyard and a dirt floor. A feast was usually tied to a religious celebration, because the church controlled everything, including when you were allowed to enjoy yourself, and peasants took these chances seriously. They would show up early, dressed in their cleanest tunic, the one that only had 8 holes instead of 15, because a feast meant one thing: actual food. On a feast day, the tables overflowed with things peasants normally only dreamed about while gnawing hungry cold bread. There was meat, actual chunks of it, not salted slivers or boned fragments. Pork roasted over an open fire, dripping with fat like some medieval miracle. Chicken stuffed with herbs peasants rarely saw outside the Lord's kitchen. Maybe even a bit of beef carved into thick slices and passed around like it was holy. There were pies too, savory pastries filled with meat, vegetables, and hope. They were seasoned, rich, and warm, and they smelled like comfort, a scent peasants barely recognized. There were sweet treats, honey cakes, fruit tarts, and puddings made with ingredients so luxurious they bordered on sinful. Even the ale was stronger. Not weak breakfast ale, but celebration ale, the kind with enough alcohol to convince a grown man to dance in public, which peasants absolutely did badly, but joyfully. Feasts weren't all the meals. There were social explosions. Singing, dancing, laughing, arguing, hugging, accidentally punching someone during a folk dance. All the wholesome medieval chaos you can imagine. For one day, peasants weren't crushed by work or hunger. They were part of something lively, communal, and worn. Children ran around with sticky fingers and sugar-high enthusiasm. Old villagers told embarrassing stories that probably weren't true. Even the livestock looked confused as to why everyone was smiling. Like all good things in peasant life, feasts ended, the music faded, the fires dimmed, the leftover food disappeared faster than hope in February, and the next day, everyone went back to gruel. Still, for one glorious night, peasants tasted the life they never got to live. Preserving food in the Middle Ages wasn't a culinary skill. It was a desperate annual negotiation with death. Every autumn, peasants looked at their harvest, looked at the sky, and thought, well, let's see how much of this survives past January without turning into a biological experiment. That's where the Holy Trinity came in: salt, smoke, and the kind of prayer normally reserved for last rites. Salt was the MVP of survival. If you had enough, you could preserve meat, fish, vegetables, and possibly even your sanity. Unfortunately, salt was expensive, so peasants used it like modern people use printer ink, sparingly, reluctantly, and while muttering curses. When they did salt meat, they didn't just season it, they entombed it. The meat looked less like dinner and more like a corpse prepared for a royal funeral. Months later, when you dug it out, you hoped the salt had worked, and not simply preserved the smell of failure. Smoking was the second great option. Hang the meat above the hearth. Let it bathe in smoke for days, until it turns into something between jerky and medieval plywood. It lasted forever, mostly because even bacteria refused to get involved. The flavor, imagine licking a chimney while chewing on a belt. But it didn't kill you, which was the general standard for medieval cuisine. Drying food was another strategy. Apples, beans, peas, anything that didn't sprint away was sliced, spread out, and left to shrivel in the sun. Sure, bugs got into it sometimes, but peasants didn't panic about bugs. Bugs were simply extra texture, or bonus meat. If it moved, you flicked it. If it didn't move, you pretended it never had. Of course, despite your best attempts, some food just mutated. Barrels swelled ominously, jars hissed, and stale bread developed fur thick enough to survive winter on its own. That's when peasants turned to the final method of preservation: prayer mixed with denial. If the food smelled weird, you prayed. If it looked weird, you prayed harder. If it growled, you gave it to the pigs and considered it divine intervention. In the end, medieval food preservation was never about taste. It was about staying alive with dignity hanging by a thread. If your winter meals tasted like salted smoke and existential dread, congratulations, you preserved them correctly. By evening, you're starving again. Not peckish, not I could nibble something, but the kind of full medieval starvation where your stomach begins narrating its own tragic backstory. The day's work is done. Your limbs feel like you borrowed them from a scarecrow. And now it's time for the most emotionally fragile meal of the day, the evening snack. A culinary event held together by hope, crumbs, and lowered expectations. You feel lucky, and by lucky I mean blessed by at least 3 minor saints. You get a chunk of yesterday's bread. Not soft bread, not warm bread, but the kind of stale bread that could break into your house at night and rob you. This bread doesn't bend, it threatens. You don't chew it so much as negotiate with it, slowly wearing it down like a river-eroding stone. By the end, your jaw is filing a complaint with your skeleton. Sometimes instead of bread, you get a roasted onion. Yes, an onion. A whole onion eaten proudly, publicly, and without shame. Medieval peasants didn't consider it weird. They considered it dinner theatre. You'd bite into that caramelized bulb and pretend it was sweet, when in reality, it tasted like poverty with a slightly warmer aftertaste. If the day was especially generous, you might get a cup of ale, not because you're celebrating anything, but because medieval life required emotional cushioning. The ale is weak, but it takes the edge off your hunger, just enough that your body stops threatening to cannibalize itself. Children drink it because water is basically medieval roulette and no one wants to raise their kids on diseases they can't pronounce. On rare evenings you get cold gruel, not warm gruel, not fresh gruel. Cold, gelatinous, morally questionable gruel that jiggles in a way food probably shouldn't. You stare at it. It stares back. You eat it anyway. It stares. And sometimes you get nothing. Just vibes and disappointment. You lie down hoping tomorrow magically produces more calories. Maybe a rabbit will wander by. Maybe an neighbor will trade you an egg. Maybe the cabbage in your garden will grow to overnight. Medieval hope was very specific, but regardless of what you manage to eat, the goal is simple. Consume something so that you can fall asleep with at least a whisper of energy for tomorrow's identical suffering. By the time night settles over the village, everything hurts. Your feet hurt. Your back hurts. Your pride hurts. Even your hunger has developed its own personality and is now pacing angrily inside your rib cage. But before surrendering to unconsciousness, there's one final ritual every medieval peasant must perform. The late-night ale of survival. This ale isn't fancy. It isn't refreshing. It isn't cold. It isn't even particularly good. But it exists. And in medieval Europe, that alone makes it a blessing. You hold the cup like it's medicine, salvation, and emotional support all minus and minus one. You take a sip. It tastes faintly of barley, smoke, and whatever the cup was washed with, if it was washed at all. But immediately, a warm numbness spreads through your body. Your stomach, which has been filing noise complaints all day, finally quiets. Your muscles unclench. For a brief moment, you remember what peace feels like. This is when the regret creeps in. Not existential regret, just the simple medieval kind. Regret that tomorrow is the same thing all over again. You think of tomorrow's gruel, tomorrow's bread brick, tomorrow's onion, tomorrow's endless labor. Then you take another sip of ale until you don't think very much at all. Once the ale has done its job and softened the sharp corners of reality, it's time for bed, or the medieval approximation of a bed. You collapse onto a straw mattress that crunches like autumn leaves and smells faintly of livestock smoke, and choices you didn't make. The strop oats you in places you didn't know had nerve endings, but you're too tired to care. You shift around until the pokiest deep part of the mattress stabs you somewhere you can live with. Your blanket is a coarse, wool sheet that feels like it was designed by someone who hated skin. It's itchy, heavy, and probably hosting a thriving ecosystem of insects. Still, it's warm, and warmth is a luxury. You curl up under it, listening to the quiet sounds of the village. Distant snoring, clucking chickens, a dog barking at a ghost only can see. Your stomach growls. You ignore it. Tomorrow you'll eat again. Not much, not well, but enough. You close your eyes. The ale pulls you under. The regret dissolves. And with a final sigh, you whisper the medieval bedtime mantra. Please let tomorrow's gruel taste less like sadness, and then sleep. Marco Polo never explicitly wrote, "I entered the Great Khan's harem," because doing so would have meant instant disappearance into some remote Mongol steppe ditch. But in his notes, those strange half-minus-coded passages, he claimed were just observations. There are cracks wide enough to glimpse a hidden world, a world he shouldn't have been anywhere near, a world reserved for silk-veiled women, an UKS with perfect memory, and the Emperor's most jealously guarded mysteries. And yet, Marco describes details no ordinary court visitor could possibly have known unless he ventured far closer than protocol allowed. He mentions chambers arranged in flower-minus-like order, a phrase that seems poetic until you compare it with your architectural custom, circular suites radiating from a central pavilion, each one assigned to a different rank of concubine. He writes of women who change garments by the seasons, noting fabrics that only palace residents could wear, light Weiger silks for spring, heady quilted brocades for winter, and scented cotton robes reserved for the emperor's favored companions. How would a foreign merchant know this unless someone let him see it? But the strangest hint comes in his descriptions of scent. Marco writes of fragrances layered like music, a distinctly intimate detail. The Mongol harem used a strict perfume hierarchy. High-ranking companions wore muscadumber. Lesser concubines were restricted to iris water or rose. Servants were forbidden perfume altogether. These rules weren't public court gossip. There were internal regulations known only to the people who lived behind the silk curtains. Marco shouldn't have known any of this. And yet he writes about it as casually as he describes the price of paper in the marketplace. His tone to give some away. In his traveled diary, he is usually a merchant cataloguing curiosities. But his writing shifts, becoming almost cautious, tender, observational in a way that implies proximity. He speaks of eyes that watch even when lowered, of voices trained to calm storms, of rooms where the emperor is never alone, yet no one dares to speak. These aren't the words of someone repeating rumors. They're the words of someone who stood close enough to feel the room breathe. And so the first mystery of Marco Polo's secret notes is simple. If he truly never entered the harem, why does he write like a man who saw its shadows flicker just inches from his face? If Marco's first hints reveal proximity, his second set of notes exposes something even bolder. For clear understanding of the harem's internal hierarchy, its tiers, privileges, punishments, and the invisible ladder every concubine feared or fought to climb. Official Chinese court records describe it in stiff bureaucratic language. Marco's descriptions breathe. They feel lived. They feel witnessed. He writes of those closest to the Ka, a Chen who walk as if the floor itself bends beneath them, referring to the 4 senior consorts, the highest-ranking women in the entire palace. They held authority second only to the empress and were effectively political officers. Beneath them, Marco hints at the ladies who wait in twilight, likely describing the Joring Jiao Rang, middle-ranking favorites who could catch the emperor's eye for months, all be forgotten in a single dawn. And then there were the flowers of the outer garden, his poetic name for the lowest-ranking concubines, girls taken from conquered kingdoms, tribute offerings, or daughters of powerful families hoping to buy imperial favor. Their lives were a mixture of luxury and dread. They lived in silk but moved in fear. One misstep, one wrong glance, one whisper overheard by the wrong servant had ended their ascent before it began. Marco even implies the existence of informal ranks, the unwritten laws of the harem. These were not decreed by the emperor, but by the women themselves. Senior concubines controlled perfume allotments, chose which dancers performed at festivals, and most terrifyingly determined who was fit to serve the KHN personally. A woman denied by them didn't rise ever. He also notes the strange economics of affection in the UN world. High-ranking concubines received bolts of gold-threaded silken jars of rare Tibetan musk. Others were given lesser gifts. Hairpins, fans, small mirrors, tokens meant to maintain order more than affection. The emperor's attention was currency, and every woman lived in a kind of emotional stock market where fortunes rose and collapsed overnight. Marco's most daring line reads, "Even silence has rank among them." Only a man who had seen the harem in motion, its whispers, glances, rituals, would phrase it like that. Whether he stepped through those guarded doors or merely got close enough to hear what others missed, His notes leave no doubt. The harem was not just a place. It was a theater of power where desire was structured, regulated, and weaponized with precision. Among Marco Polo's strangest and most revealing observations are his notes on scent. Not clothing, not jewels, not gestures. Scent. This alone tells us he was far closer to the harem world than any foreigner was supposed to be. Perfume in the Yuan imperial court wasn't simply a luxury. It was a language, a ranking system, and a weapon. And Marco describes it with the precision of someone who had breathed it in himself. He writes that a woman's presence may be known before her foot crosses the threshold, an unmistakable reference to the perfumed hierarchy that regulated who wore what. High-ranking consorts were permitted heady lingering fragrances that announced their approach. Tibetan musk, ambergris imported from the Indian Ocean, and the precious resin known as dragon's brain which only the emperor's favorites were allowed to use. These scents were strong-layered and unmistakable. They didn't just enter a room, they conquered it, Marco continues. Some smell of spring, others of dawn after rain. This is his coded way of describing the middle ranks, who were limited to lighter perfumes, iris water, osmantha soil, touches of clove, or sweet flag. These scents whispered rather than shouted, marking their wearers as desirable but not dominant. Marco's descriptions show he understood these subtleties perfectly, that the most telling detail comes from his notes on the lowest ranks. He writes, "Many wear no scent at all, for to carry fragrance without right is to borrow a crown without permission." This was indeed an unbreakable rule. The lowest-ranking women were forbidden strong perfumes. Their bodies were washed in unscented rice water. Their clothing smelled only of the cedarwood chests in which they were stored. To wear a scent above one's rank was a punishable offense, one that implied ambition, deceit, or seduction out of turn. Even more fascinating is Marco's mention of seasonal scents, mentioning the warming odor of winter and the cooling aroma as of summer. This reflects the harem's elaborate seasonal rotation, warming fragrances like cinnamon and musk in cold months, cooling ones like and walden lotus when the palace sweltered. Every scent had a function, every aroma had a meaning, and then almost carelessly, Marco adds, some scents cling to the skin long after the woman has gone. That is not something a man writes when he learns these rules from a distance. His notes don't simply describe perfume, they betray proximity. Too much proximity for a mere traveler. If perfumes revealed rank, the tests of loyalty revealed something far more precious: survival. Marco Polo's notes grow strangely cautious when he describes these rituals, as if writing them down might offend someone powerful. Yet he still records them encoded in metaphors often, with poetic language but clear enough to reconstruct the hidden machinery of the harem. He writes that the KHN rusts, snow heart that has not first been weighed. A statement that seems vague until you realize the UN harem used multi-stage loyalty assessments to separate the obedient from the ambitious. The first test was obedience in silence. Marco describes gatherings where women wait like still water, making no ripple unless stirred. This was literal. The emperor's attendants would observe how long a woman could remain motionless, voicing no complaint and showing no impatience. A concubine who fidgeted, sighed, or reacted was considered unreliable. Next came the test of truth, conducted not by the emperor, but by senior concubines undone ICS. Marco hints at eyes that can read the spine of a lie before the mouth forms it. A poetic way of describing interrogations disguised as casual conversation. These elder women were trained to detect ambition, resentment, or hidden loyalties, especially lingering attachment to a girl's family or tribe. One careless remark, and a concubine might find herself reassigned, demoted, or quietly removed from consideration. Then came the most feared ritual, the test of devotion. Marco calls it a night where the moon sees more than the candles, suggesting a ceremony where personal behavior was evaluated with almost spiritual seriousness. The chosen concubines were observed by attendants as they prepared for potential summons. How they dressed, how they helped one another, how they spoke when they believed no authority listened. A woman who displayed envy, vanity, or cruelty failed instantly. The emperor wanted loyalty, not intrigue. Marco's most unsettling note refers to the test no one speaks of except in glances. Scholars believe he meant the loyalty of the body, ensuring a concubine had no lovers, no secret attachments, no risk of bearing a child not fathered by the KHN. Medical examinations, supervised washing, even controlled movement within palace walls ensured absolute exclusivity. These rituals weren't merely tests. They were filters refining a harem of hundreds into a trusted inner circle. Marco writes about them with the tone of someone who did not merely hear rumors, but sensed the anxiety in the air, the tension behind every elegant gesture. No outsider describes fear as precisely unless he has walked beside it. If the concubines were the hidden stars of the harem, the unUKS were its gravity, quiet, constant, unseen, but inescapable. Marco Polo's notes suddenly sharpen when he speaks of them, as if even he understood that these men, half servants, half spies, were the real enforcers of the emperor's private world. His descriptions are unusually careful, full of respect and subtle fear. He writes of men who move like shadows, yet carry the weight of the sun, a poetic but accurate summary of their paradoxical role. Eunuchs had no families, no heirs, no clans to protect. That made them in the emperor's eyes incapacit. They lived entirely within the palace ecosystem and therefore owed every breath to the throne. Marco knew this, and he hints that approaching the harem without their approval was impossible. Marco describes how the eunuchs memorized everything: names, scents, footsteps, even the way each concubine lowered her eyes. They were trained to detect the smallest irregularities, and Polo writes of them, hearing what others only feel. They oversaw the baths, the dressing chambers, the night rotations, and the delivery of imperial summons. Any deviation, any unsanctioned movement, any hint of a private interaction gone, the units would erase it before it left a trace. Most fascinating are Marco's notes on their ritual responsibilities. He mentions the keepers of purity, likely referring to eunuchs who supervised the concubines' living quarters. These men ensured no outsider could enter and no woman could leave without authorization. Marco hints at secret passageways, corridors narrow enough for only one body to pass, used exclusively by them to appear and disappear at will. This matches Chinese court records describing labyrinthine service routes beneath and around palace women's chambers. He also reveals that eunuchs were responsible for the emperor's nightly selections. Before any concubine was summoned, eunuchs prepared her chamber, checked her attire, inspected her hair and perfume, and recorded the event in secret logs. Marco writes, "Nothing touches the emperor unless touched first by them. A foreign observer would have no access to this knowledge unless he stood close enough to watch a eunuch at work, or close enough to be watched by one." Yet Marco's most striking line is this: "But each word can break a kingdom." Eunuchs controlled information, rumors, schedules, and access. A whisper from one of them could elevate a concubine or destroy her, and they knew it. Marco's precise insights are impossible unless he hovered near the heart of their operations. Too close for a simple merchant, far too close for comfort. In most court, an emperor's private nights were hidden behind walls of rumor. But in the Yuan Palace, these nights were choreographed like a ceremony, half ritual, half surveillance. And Marco Polo's notes describe them with a precision that borders on the forbidden. He calls them the hours when the palace breathed differently, implying he witnessed preparations firsthand, or at the very least stood close enough to hear what outsiders never should. He explains that the emperor never chose a concubine on the spot. The decision was made out earlier by an intricate machine of NICS attendants and senior consorts. Marco writes that the emperor's desire is a river guided by many hands, hinting that politics, alliances, and harem hierarchies shaped the nightly summons just as much as the emperor's mood. The ritual began with purification. Marco describes concubines bathing in warm water infused with lotus and silkwood. Their skin dried with cloth scented lightly so as not to overpower the emperor. Their hair was braided in specific patterns, simple for lower ranks, elaborate for favorite, with jade pins reserved solely for the highest consorts. A single misplaced pin could signal jealousy or ambition. Marco's awareness of these subtleties suggests proximity, no translator would bother to pass. He also notes the emperor's insistence on calmness. Before a concubine was brought forward, eunuchs examined her expression. A trembling lip, a nervous blink, even a heartbeat too fast could lead to dismissal. Marco writes of faces painted not with color, but with discipline. The sharp and accurate description of the mental stillness demanded of any woman entering the emperor's presence. The journey itself was ceremonial. The concubine was carried, not allowed to walk, wrapped in a quilted blanket to symbolize purity and prevent her feet from touching the ground. And even then they kept their eyes lowered. Marco notes this with fascination. She moves like a secret being transported, not a woman walking. This detail appears in Chinese records, but for a European traveler to include it shows he heard or saw the practice more directly than expected. Finally, Marco reveals the most intimate rule. The concubine once chosen could not speak unless addressed. Silence was not submission. It was protocol. The emperor was to feel that desire moved toward him effortlessly without plea or performance. Marco's ability to recount these details suggests he lingered far closer to the emperor's shadowed rituals than any outsider had a right to. If Marco Polo's earlier notes describe order, this chapter reveals the chaos beneath it. The rivalries, jealousies, and subtle wars fought between concubines who lived closer to power than ministers, yet further from freedom than prisoners. Marco writes of the harem as a garden where flowers compete for the same sun, a deceptively gentle metaphor for a system where beauty was currency, favor was oxygen, and neglect was a slow death. According to him, the fiercest tensions were not between high and low ranks, but with thin adjacent ranks, where ambition was close enough to taste. Ajli and Zhao Ang might share attendance corridors, music tutors, and the same fear that one evening selection could elevate one woman and freeze the other in place forever. Marco notes that their smiles were wide enough to hide teeth, implying politeness was often a mask for rivalry sharp enough to wound. He describes three primary battlegrounds: appearance, influence, and rumor. In appearance, Marco notes they sculpt their silence as carefully as their hair, meaning discipline mattered more than beauty. A perfectly controlled gaze could signal confidence. A flicker of envy could invite scrutiny. Women learned to weaponize grace, to move softly enough to seem harmless, yet visible enough to remind the emperor and everyone else that they still existed. Influence was subtler. Senior concubines controlled music teachers, embroidery supplies, dance rehearsals, even perfume access. A single withheld resource could sabotage a rival's preparation for an imperial summon. Marco hints that some women fed rivals bad advice. Some whisper guidance that leads only to shadows, a clear reference to sabotage club to sisterly concern. But the deadliest battlefield, Marco writes, was rumor. Words could wound where hands could not. A suggestion that a rival was too ambitious, too emotional, or too attached to her old clan could doom her quietly. The emperor never heard the rumors directly. Eunuchs and senior consorts carried them upward like smoke. Marco, listening from somewhere he shouldn't have been, writes that no lie travels faster than one spoken softly. And yet he adds a final, almost tragic insight. Even enemies braid each other's hair. The harem forced intimacy. Rivals shared rooms, meals, tutors, and rituals. They sang together in the evenings, practiced dances in synchrony, knelt side by side during ceremonies. Their hatred had to be soft enough to hide under silk. Marco captures this paradox perfectly. In and bound together yet set against each other, competing for the affection of a single man who would outlive most of them. If rivalry was the daily tension of the harem, rumor was its deadliest weapon. Marco Polo's notes become strangely sharp here, as if he wanted to record this part with more precision, either because he witnessed the effects himself, or because someone inside the palace whispered the truth directly into his ear. He writes, "In this place, a word weighs more than a sword, and in the Yuan harem that was no metaphor. Rumors did not flow tamelessly. They were launched like arrows. A concubine who wanted to weaken a rival rarely acted herself. She planted a seed with a eunuch, a lady in waiting, or a musician who drifted between quarters. Marco notes that these messengers carry songs, stories, and secrets, moving information as effortlessly as it circulates through a room. What made rumor terrifying was its plausible deniability. No one ever knew where it began, only where it ended. The deadliest accusation one could suffer was disloyalty, not to the harem order. A whisper that a woman had spoken against another consort or resented a gift or cried after a dismissal could be interpreted as instability. Mako writes that even sorrow is dangerous if seen by the wrong eyes. If a rival spread such a rumor, eunuchs would watch the woman more closely. A senior concubine might limit her perfume or restrict her attendance, small punishments that created an impression of guilt. Another lethal rumor involved outside attachment, that a woman still longed for a man from her home region, that she kept a hidden token from her past. Mako describes this with surprising empathy, noting that memory is not a crime, it can be made into one. Such accusations, even if false, could remove a concubine from the emperor's rotation indefinitely. Yet, the most insidious rumor was the one Marco calls the shadow without a source, a suggestion that a woman was unlucky, not immoral, not rebellious, simply unfortunate. A concubine who wasn't chosen for a season might be labeled cold in spirit. An inner illness could be reframed as spiritual contamination. Once this idea took hold, no one wanted to be seen with her. Misfortune was contagious. Marco's notes reveal that many women feared these whispered fates more than death itself because death ended suffering. Rumors prolonged it. A woman destroyed by rumor did not vanish. She faded slowly, painfully, invisibly. And Marco ends the chapter with an unsettling line. In a palace of 1,000 lamps, the darkest rooms are made of words. Marco Polo ends his hints about the harem with passages so half-veiled that scholars still argue whether they are metaphor, memory, or confession. But read closely, and one thing becomes clear. These were not casual travel observations. They were forbidden notes written by a man who saw more than he was ever meant to. He admits that certain halls of the palace were guarded not by walls but by silence. A striking comment that suggests he learned of these places not from officials but from whispers traded in the shadows. Marco speaks of doors that open only when the moon climbs high, describing nighttime movements within the palace, movements he had no formal right to witness. His curiosity was dangerous, but something or someone kept feeding it. A most tantalizing line appears almost casually. I once saw lantern light when no lantern should be. What was he doing in a restricted corridor at night? Why did a concubine's chambers appear in his notes with such descriptive clarity? These questions have haunted historians for centuries. Marco also writes about secrets the women entrusted to no man. Yet he lists details of their routines, perfumes, rivalries, and terrors with disarming accuracy. Either he was a quick student of gossip, or he had a source inside those forbidden walls. His wording hints at the latter. He describes a voice soft as folded silk that told stories the palace itself had forgotten. A woman, a servant, a eunuch who found him amusing. Every possibility is dangerous. Then comes the most shocking implication. A single glance taught me more than a week of listening. Glances require proximity. They require presence. They require presence. Marco's descriptions of forbidden architecture. Curved door frames carved with phoenix motifs, embroidered screens depicting lovers separated by rivers. Corridors lined with perfumed cloth match no public section of the palace. These belonged to women's quarters, shielded from diplomacy and foreign eyes. Yet, he catalogues them with the precision of a man's catching from memory. Still, Marco never claims authority. He hides behind modesty, saying his knowledge comes only from reports gathered humbly. But the tone betrays him. Men who repeat rumors write loosely. Next to him, a Yemen incense trader displayed frankincense nuggets the size of walnuts. Their sweet smoke, curling upward like prayers made visible. Indian ship captains, still smelling faintly of sea salt, arrived with pepper, coconuts, and rare woods carved into delicate figurines. African merchants from the Swahili coast brought ivory chimes, gold dust, and intricately dyed cloth with geometric patterns bold enough to catch any eye passing by. But it wasn't only products that traveled. It was stories. A Persian astronomer would debate star charts with an Andalusian scholar who claimed the skies looked different above Cordoba. A Berber caravan leader might recount crossing the Sahara, describing dunes as tall as palaces. Chinese envoys brought lacquer so smooth it reflected lantern light like water. And if one was lucky, they told of distant cities where fireworks lit the sky brighter than Baghdad's lamps. These people didn't merely browse or trade, they mingled, forming a human river flowing through the winding alleys. You could hear 5 languages in a single minute: Arabic, Persian, Greek, Tiuric, Swahili, sometimes even Chinese. Foreigners often said no city in the world felt as alive, as layered, or as welcoming at night. And Baghdad embraced them. The night market was an equalizer. No one cared about your rank or homeland under the soft glow of lanterns. A fisherman from the Tigris could stand shoulder to minus shoulder with a merchant who owned caravans stretching from Damascus to Summit. Trade forged friendships. Stories forged bonds. Deals forged futures. And as the night deepened, the crowd only grew larger. Because in Baghdad, darkness didn't silence the world. It gathered it. If merchants supplied the goods, artists supplied the soul of Baghdad's night markets. As the darkness thickened and lanterns glowed brighter, poets, musicians, storytellers, and wandering performers spilled into the squares like sparks from a fire. In medieval Baghdad, art wasn't confined to palaces or scholarly halls. It belonged to the streets. And nowhere did it shine more brilliantly than under the oil lamps of the night bazaar. The poets were often the first to draw crowds. They stood on raised carpets or overturned crates, reciting verses that flowed like silk, sometimes romantic, sometimes mystical, sometimes hilariously mocking corrupt officials or boastful merchants. The words carried the perfume of Arabic literature shaped by the traditions of Al-Mutanabbi, Abu Nuwas, and hundreds of lesser-known talents who lit up the night for a few copper coins. Lovers drifted close, pretending to shop while secretly listening for lines that echoed their own hearts. Nearby, musicians plucked at, struck tambourines, and played flutes so soft they seemed to weave themselves into the night breeze. The melodies shifted with the crowd, slow and smoky when the evening was young, vibrant and fast when the market swelled, then warm and nostalgic after midnight, when only the devoted remained. A single ode player could gather 50 people without calling out a word. The music itself was an invitation. Then came the storytellers, the Hakawates, who commanded the loudest circles. Children sat wide-eyed at their feet while adults lingered at the edges, pretending they weren't just as captivated. The stories blended myth, history, and outright fantasy. One moment, the crowd traveled through the deserts with Sinbad. The next they were eating jyn in abandoned ruins or watching K-Fest disguise themselves to walk among the poor. These tales were not fixed. Each storyteller added, subtracted, embellished. Baghdad's night didn't just preserve legends, it reinvented them. Sufi mystics wandered between performers, chanting verses of divine love that drifted like smoke between the stalls. Sometimes they stopped to whirl in short meditative dances, their movements casting spinning shadows across the market floor. Philosophers from the House of Wisdom occasionally joined these circles, turning the market into an impromptu academy where debates on ethics or astronomy unfolded, next to melon sellers and spice merchants. In Baghdad, the night market was a living theater. No curtain, no stage, just people, voices, instruments, and a city that believed art belonged to everyone. In most medieval cities, night meant rest, but in Baghdad, capital of the Abbasid Caliphate and cradle of the Islamic Golden Age, night meant study. And nowhere was this more visible than in the bookstores that glittered like treasure chests along the night market's busiest lanes. Under rows of oil lamps, you could find scholars, scribes, translators, and curious wanderers gathered around piles of manuscripts as if they were examining jewels. Books were Baghdad's greatest luxury, but also its greatest addiction. The House of Wisdom, the empire's intellectual crown, stayed active long after sundown. Scholars often left its halls buzzing with ideas and wandered straight into the night markets, eager to argue, research, or buy freshly copied volumes before returning to their own late-night work. And so the bookstores became an extension of the great library, a public annex where debate and education were as common as commerce. Booksellers treated their craft like performance. They stacked volumes of poetry, philosophy, medicine, astronomy, mathematics, and translated Greek text with exaggerated precision, letting the spines catch the lantern light. A good bookseller didn't simply sell a manuscript. He recommended readings, recited favorite lines, compared authors, and could match a buyer with the perfect text as if prescribing medicine. One stall might offer a translation of Aristotle that had passed through 3 languages, Greek to Syriac, Syriac to Arabic, each layer adding new interpretation. Another might display a fresh copy of Al-Khwarizmi's work on algebra still smelling of ink. A third would feature poetry collections, Rumi, Al-Mute and R.B., or sometimes a young local poet hoping to be discovered. Travelers said that even if you entered with no intention to buy a book, you left with at least 2. But the real magic was the scholars who browsed there. They were impossible to miss. Their eyes alight, their fingers tracing calligraphy, their voices rising excitedly whenever a debate began. One mathematician might argue with a physician about the nature of infinity. A historian might interrupt with a comment about ancient Persia. A teenage student could jump in and astonish everyone with a perfectly memorized verse. The night market was a university without walls, and the atmosphere was contagious. Even ordinary citizens felt pulled into conversations, drawn by the scholars' enthusiasm. People stayed not because they understood everything, but because Baghdad made learning feel like a celebration, a communal act as natural as breathing. Under the lanterns, surrounded by ink and parchment, Baghdad felt like a city that refused to let the mind sleep. If the lanterns lit the markets, and the poets gave them voice, then the food vendors gave Baghdad its heartbeat. The night market was a feast long before it was a marketplace. Long after the day's formal meals had ended, the true flavors of the city emerged. Smoky, spicy, sweet, sizzling, irresistible. Every corner seemed to hum with fire and fragrance. Follow the scent of charcoal and you'd find grilled lamb kebabs sputtering over open flames seasoned with cumin and coriander until the air itself tasted warm. Beside them, cooks chopped onions and parsley with rhythmic thumps that blended into the market's music, drizzled with lemon and draped in warm bread. These kebabs were the unofficial evening meal of Baghdad. Cheap enough for a laborer, delicious enough for a scholar. Next came the stew sellers, stirring in enormous copper pots filled with lentils, chickpeas, and slow-minus cooked meats. Their steam clouds rose into the lantern light like glowing spirits. Customers lined up with clay bowls, eager to taste a broth seasoned with cinnamon, pepper, and garlic. Some vendors added dried limes for a sour, irresistible twist, a flavor signature of Iraqi cuisine that made travelers pause mid-bite, eyes widening in surprise. Sweet makers were the market's crown. Tables overflowed with dates stuffed with almonds, sesame-coated pastries, fried dough drenched in honey, and rosewater sweets so fragrant they competed with the perfume sellers. The sound of syrup dripping onto hot pastries made passers-by stop out of instinct. It was dessert theater. Children tugged at their parents' sleeves. Adults pretended to buy just one, then returned minutes later for 3 more. But the true centerpiece of the night market was the tea vendors. Their kettles hissed like serpents as they poured strong tea brewed with cardamom. The cups were tiny, but the flavor was immense. People didn't drink tea to refresh themselves. They drank to stay awake, to talk, to debate, to linger just a little longer under the lamps. A single pot could fuel an hour-minus-long discussion about poetry, politics, astronomy, or gossip. Other treats dotted the alleys. Roasted chickpeas crackling in iron pans, melon slices chilled in river-cooled basins, saffron rice cakes wrapped in banana leaves, yogurt drinks poured over crushed mint leaves. And everywhere, always, food was shared. Strangers offered bites to strangers. Vendors slipped extra pieces to children. A scholar and a fisherman could sit side by side on a bench, elbows touching, both licking honey from their fingers. Because in Baghdad, the night didn't just feed the stomach, it nourished the city's soul. Beyond the bright stalls and crowded squares, the night markets of medieval Baghdad had another layer, deeper, quieter, almost secretive. If the lantern-lit bazaars were the city's face, these hidden corners were its pulse. Here, under the dimmer glow of smaller lamps, healers, mystics, fortune-tellers, and apothecaries carried out work that blended medicine, superstition, and ancient tradition. The healers were impossible to miss. They sat behind baskets of herbs that smelled of earth and memory: dried mint, lavender, myrrh, resin, fennel seeds, bitter almonds, and strange roots brought by caravans from the Zy Gross Mountains. Their tools were simple: mortars, pestles, copper bowls, but their reputations were complex. Some word reigned in scientific remedies from the hospitals of Baghdad, where medicine was advancing faster than anywhere in the world. Others relied on folk wisdom passed down for generations. Most were a blend of both. They mixed tinctures to ease stomach troubles, pastes for wounds, teas for sleep stuns, and powders to calm tempers. Some healers whispered Quranic verses as they were. Others recited Greek medical theories like they were poetry. And yet most customers didn't care about the method, only the relief. A few steps away, the fortune-tellers sat behind carpets decorated with symbols, talismans, and cracked bowls used for scrying. They read palms, cast shells, interpreted dreams, and predicted journeys. Some were old women with piercing eyes. Others were young men with silver tongues and pockets full of charms. People approached them cautiously, half believing, half doubting, but always curious. Baghdad was a city of knowledge, but also one that left room for mystery. Even a scholar might secretly ask whether a journey would be safe or a marriage prosperous. The apothecaries were somewhere between healer and magician. Their shelves overflowed with jars of colored powders, oils, perfumes, dried insects, and curious stones pulled from riverbeds. They sold ingredients for remedies, yes, but also for love potions, protective amulets, and rituals meant to chase away the evil eye. Their clientele ranged from anxious merchants to confident poets seeking inspiration. These corners of the market had a different sound from the bustling center. Here, voices dropped to whispers. Lanterns flickered instead of shining bright. People moved slowly, not out of laziness, but reverence. Every remedy, omen, and charm carried weight, and in these quiet pockets, under dim light and drifting incense, Baghdad revealed a softer truth. Knowledge could heal bodies, mystery could soothe hearts, and the night had room for both. No matter how alive the night felt, dawn always approached with quiet certainty, and in the night markets of medieval Baghdad, the final hour before sunrise was its own kind of enchantment, softer, slower, almost melancholic. The lanterns still glowed, but their light weakened as the sky lightened. The oil inside them thinned. Their flames shrank. It was as if the city itself exhaled, tired yet satisfied, after a night of storytelling, trading, singing, and feasting. Vendors began their gentle ritual of closing. Spice sellers covered their pyramids of color with linen cloths. Sweet lakers poured the last streaks of honey from their copper pans, letting it cool into amber threads. Tea vendors emptied kettles, their hissing fading like the final notes of a long performance. Perfume sellers carried bottles of rose water and musk, careful not to spill a drop. Scent was too precious to waste even at dawn. The poets' voices softened. The musicians set down their instruments. Even the storytellers, who could talk for hours without tiring, paused mid-tale, and promised to continue tomorrow night. By this time, the crowd had thinned. Scholars drifted home with ink-stained fingers and new books tucked under their arms. Travelers slipped away to roadside inns. Families gathered the last treats for breakfast. Street cats claimed leftover scraps with triumphant miwas. The market felt less like a festival and more like a memory folding itself neatly away. The river was the first to reflect morning. The tigerish shimmer red pale silver and the reflection of lanterns blurred into soft streaks before disappearing entirely. Fishermen appeared with their nets, greeting the night vendors as if they belonged to opposite worlds. One ending, one beginning. The scent of bread baking in nearby ovens signaled that Baghdad's daytime life was stirring. But for those who experienced it fully, the transition felt bittersweet. The night markets were Baghdad at its most alive. A place where merchants, mystics, scholars, artists, sailors, and wanderers shared the same streets without hesitation or hierarchy. By day, the city was brilliant. By night, it was intimate. When the oil lamps finally dimmed, it felt like waking from a dream you desperately wanted to remember. As the sun crested above the city's rooftops, the last vendors walked home carrying empty baskets but full hearts. They knew that once the heat faded and the shadows lengthened, Baghdad would bloom all over again. The night did not die. It merely slept. Because in this golden age, the city's true pulse beat strongest under the stars. At 16, Gus Julius Caesar discovered that childhood could evaporate in a single afternoon. His father died suddenly. Not in battle, not in disgrace, but quietly, almost politely, leaving behind neither scandal nor explanation. Yet for Caesar, this calm departure triggered a storm that would reshape the rest of his life. In a republic obsessed with lineage and alliances, a father was not just a parent, he was a shield. And with that shield gone, Caesar stood exposed before the most dangerous forces in Rome. The first days after the death were filled with ritual, visitors, and whispered condolences. But beneath the mourning hung an unspoken anxiety. Caesar's family, the Iuli, were ancient, noble, and proud. But noble didn't mean powerful. They were respected, yes, but politically fragile. And in 85 B.C. Rome was not a city where fragility went unnoticed. Here is your text with each sentence separated onto its own line. Caesar watched as relatives measured their words, as household slaves moved nervously, as his mother, Aurelia, held the family together with the still composure she became famous for. She understood the threat they faced. Rome was in the grip of Lucius Cornelius Sulla H., a man whose smile meant nothing and whose anger meant exile, or worse. Sulla H. had already flooded the city with prescriptions, long lists of enemies marked for execution. The elite trembled. Families hid their sons. Caesar, in the midst of grief, suddenly found himself a potential target. Why? Because of a marriage. Shortly before his father's death, Caesar had been betrothed to Cornelia, the daughter of S.A., one of Sulla H.'s fiercest rivals. What had once been a politically advantageous match now painted a glowing red target on his teenage back, and Caesar, even as a boy, was sharp enough to sense it. His tutors later recalled that he became restless, watchful. He walked the family atrium with the seriousness of a man twice his age. He listened more than he spoke. He learned quickly which doors in Rome were safe to knock on, and which were suddenly fatal. Losing his father forced Caesar to step into adulthood before he had time to grow into it. Its ever his protection thrust him into political crossfire, and marked the moment when the world stopped treating him as a promising boy and began treating him as a potential threat. In grief, something else took root in him, ambition born from vulnerability, and soon enough, Rome would notice. When Caesar stepped into his 17th year, Rome was no longer the bustling, argumentative city he had grown up in. It had transformed into a place where people spoke in murmurs, where neighbors avoided eye contact, and where every footstep behind you felt like a warning. Lucius Cornelius Sulla H., victorious from the civil wars, ruled the republic with icy ruthlessness. His prescriptions, It lists carved into public boards, declared who was allowed to live and who would be hunted down like an animal. Heads were displayed in the forum as everyday reminders of obedience. This was the Rome of Caesar's adolescence, and Caesar by marriage was tied to Sulla H's enemies. His young wife, Cornelia, was the daughter of Sa, the recently slain rival of Sulla H. Caesar's uncle by marriage was Gas Marius, Sulla H's most hated opponent. That made the teenage Caesar guilty by association. In Sulla H's Rome, guilt did not require action, only connection. The dictator offered Caesar a single chance to save himself: renounce Cornelia, divorce her, break the alliance, abandon the family that Sulla H despised. Many young nobles faced with the same demand obeyed without hesitation. Survival was reason enough. Loyalty was flexible. But Caesar refused. Imagine that moment. 17 years old, newly fatherless, not yet famous, not yet powerful, standing before one of the most terrifying men Rome ever produced and saying, "No." It wasn't a heroic speech. It wasn't dramatic. Caesar simply refused quietly, firmly, and that small act of defiance nearly cost him his life. Sulla H reacted with cold fury. He revoked Caesar's priesthood, stripped his inheritance, confiscated his dowry, and placed him on the edge of the proscription list. Caesar suddenly became a hunted youth. Friends distanced themselves. Supporters vanished. A single appearance in the wrong district could have ended his story before it began. But something remarkable happened. People intervened. Members of the Vestal priestesses, women Sulla H dared not defy, petitioned for Caesar's safety. Powerful relatives whispered in the dictator's ear. Sulla H reluctantly spared the boy, muttering a prophecy that chilled those who heard it. In this Caesar, there are many Mari uses. He sensed danger in the teenager, ambition, charisma, potential rebellion. And so Caesar lived, but not safely. Not in Rome, not under Sulla H's gaze. His refusal had marked him permanently. The city he loved had become a trap, and the only escape was to run. With Sulla H's wrath hanging over him like a sharpened sword, Caesar understood there was no future for him in Rome. Staying meant death. Appealing meant humiliation. Fighting meant suicide. So at 17, with nothing but his family name, a few loyal slaves, and the clothes on his back, Caesar slipped out of the city he had been born to rule. He crossed the Italian countryside not as a noble youth, but as a fugitive, hiding his identity, traveling by night and avoiding every patrol loyal to Sulla H's regime. This journey alone began shaping him. He learned to sleep lightly, to move quickly, to read danger in the smallest signs. Distant torchlight, a snapped twig, a too curious villager. The boy who once studied poetry and rhetoric now learned the art of survival, and it hardened something inside him, a quiet resolve that would later terrify his enemies. Caesar's exile took him eastward toward Asia Minor, where Rome's legions guarded wealthy coastal cities and rebellious mountain tribes. There he enlisted in the army, not as an honored noble or a political appointee, but as a young refuge, seeking protection. His family name meant little so far from Rome. His status mattered even less. What mattered was discipline, endurance, and courage. And Caesar excelled immediately. Soldiers later recalled how impossibly composed he was for his age. He endured long marches without complaint, slept on the ground without discomfort, and trained with a seriousness unusual for someone of patrician birth. He studied the legions the way he once studied rhetoric, as if understanding each detail could someday give him power. In this he was correct. For the first time, Caesar saw the empire from the military side. The grind at garrison duty, the danger of frontier patrols, the harsh landscapes that made Rome's expansion possible. He watched commanders negotiate with local kings, discipline rebellious troops, and use both brutality and diplomacy to keep the peace. These years weren't glamorous, but they were transformative. They pulled Caesar out of the sheltered orbit of Rome's elite and taught him how soldiers lived, marched, fought, and died. He wasn't the general yet. He wasn't the statesman. He wasn't even a rising star. But exile had given him something far more valuable than safety: clarity. He had glimpsed the world beyond Rome's marble facades and understood truths that would guide him for life. Strength protected you, and Rome did not reward the timid. Asia Minor was not the polished marble world of Rome. It was rugged, unpredictable, and full of enemies Rome preferred not to think about. For the teenage Caesar, it became a brutal classroom, one that taught lessons far more valuable than anything offered by tutors back home. In the hills and coastal plains of the East, Caesar encountered war not as an idea, but as a living creature, violent, chaotic, and strangely intoxicating. His first real test came during a campaign against local tribes that resisted Roman control. These were not large battles with disciplined legions maneuvering in perfect formation. They were ambushes, sharp skirmishes, and desperate charges through narrow passes where every soldier fought for his own survival. Caesar, barely 18, threw himself into the thick of it with a boldness that startled veteran legionaries. He fought not like a noble seeking glory, but like a man with something to prove, because in truth he did. During one battle, when the Roman standard-bearer faltered, Caesar reportedly seized the eagle standard himself, lifted it high, and plunged forward. It was a reckless move. It was also a brilliant one. The legion rallied around him. The enemy broke, and the officers took notice. Courage under fire was the first currency of Roman command, and Caesar spent it lavishly. But bravery wasn't the only skill he developed. In the camps after the battles, Caesar absorbed everything. He studied how commanders addressed their troops, how they distributed rewards, how they punished disobedience. He learned the delicate balance between fear and loyalty, a balance he would later master better than any Roman before him. And there was diplomacy. Caesar accompanied officers on missions to allied kings, where he watched negotiations unfold with all the subtlety of a stage play. He learned when to bow, when to flatter, when to threaten. A teenage exile, still technically unwelcome in Rome, was learning the foundations of both war and statecraft from the men who lived it every day. What truly changed him, however, was the camaraderie. In the legions, no one cared about his patrician ancestry. A soldier judged another soldier not by blood, but by bravery, endurance, and loyalty. Caesar earned respect the hard way by bleeding beside men who did not know his name months earlier. When he marched back into camp, after those early campaigns, something in him had shifted. He was no longer the frightened boy fleeing Sulla. He was a young man who had tasted battle, earned admiration, and felt the first stirrings of destiny. The army had given him safety. War had given him purpose. As the campaigns in Asia Minor continued, Caesar's reputation spread quietly through the ranks, not as a noble Minos-born youth playing at war, but as a soldier who could be trusted in the mud, rain, and blood of real campaigning. For a teenager stripped of privilege and chased out of his own city, this acceptance mattered more than any Roman title he had lost. He became the foundation of the leadership style that would later make men follow him across entire continents. Caesar adapted to military discipline with startling speed. He rose before dawn with the veterans, marched under blistering sun without complaint, and carried his own pack, even when others offered to carry it for him. He ate their rations, slept on their ground, laughed at their crude jokes, and listened to their stories of past battles. Soldiers remembered him as a young man, good Minos-natured, sharp Minos-eyed, and unusually willing to endure hardship. These qualities were rare in Roman nobles and soldiers noticed, but endurance alone didn't set him apart. It was the charisma beginning to show beneath the discipline. Even at 18 or 19, Caesar possessed a strange magnetism. He had a way of speaking that made men lean in, a way of encouraging others that felt genuine rather than commanding. He praised courage openly, forgave mistakes quietly, and never took credit that wasn't his. This blend of humility and confidence was intoxicating to the rank and file. His officers saw something else: intelligence. Caesar grasped tactics quickly. He studied maps with interest, asked questions that showed strategic curiosity, and demonstrated a natural sense for terrain. During one patrol, he spotted an ambush before it happened, saving his cohort from slaughter. Stories like this spread, and soon even hardened centurions began watching the young fugitive with interest. But perhaps his greatest strength was adaptability. When stationed in coastal towns, Caesar blended effortlessly into diplomatic missions. When assigned to rough frontier duty, he handled it with grit. When the army needed translators, he offered his limited Greek. When it needed negotiation envoys, he volunteered to accompany elders. Every task, no matter how small, became part of his growing arsenal of skills. What he was learning quietly, steadily, was how to lead Romans by being one of them. He wasn't born with the loyalty of his future legions. He earned it here, step by step, beside campfires and battlefield graves. By the time Caesar reached 19, he had become more than a fugitive seeking refuge. He was a rising force, one shaped by hardship, sharpened by war, and beginning to sense the magnitude of his own potential. Caesar's early military career wasn't just a refuge, it became the stage for his first taste of glory. And it came during a moment of desperate chaos, when the line between survival and heroism blurred into a single heartbeat. During a campaign in Asia Minor, Caesar's unit was ambushed by enemy forces who took advantage of steep terrain and narrow roads. The attack was sudden and brutal. Roman soldiers were forced back, shields locking as arrows hissed overhead. Panic began to ripple through the ranks, the kind of panic that could turn a disciplined force into a shattered mob. But Caesar, still barely past 19, refused to retreat. The accounts differ in detail, but all agree on one point. Caesar saw a fellow soldier, an older centurion, fall wounded between the lines, trapped in a deadly no-man's land. To leave him meant certain death. To rescue him meant almost the same. Caesar didn't hesitate. He surged forward, shield raised, cutting through the chaos with reckless determination. Arrows struck the ground around him. Spears glanced off his shield rim, and somehow, impossibly, he reached the wounded centurion, lifted him onto his back, and carried him in full armor back to the Roman line. The enemy surged forward. Caesar didn't break. His fellow soldiers roared, rallying around the young man who had turned certain defeat into a spark of courage. For this act, Caesar earned the Corona Civicae, the crown of oak leaves, one of Rome's highest military honors. It was awarded only to those who saved the life of another Roman in battle, and unlike most military decorations, it brought permanent privileges, public honor, reserved seating at games, and the right for others to stand in his presence. Imagine the scene. A teenage exile, stripped of wealth, hunted by Sul and Au, standing before seasoned officers as oak leaves were placed upon his head. Soldiers cheered him, officers praised him. Even the harshest veterans nodded with respect. Caesar had entered the army as a nobody. In a single heroic act, he had become a name worth remembering, but the honor did more than elevate him. It ignited him. For the first time, Caesar witnessed how courage could bend fate, how bold action could carve a path through impossible circumstances. He tasted recognition, loyalty, momentum, and he realized something crucial. Rome rewarded courage far more than obedience. The oak crown wasn't just a decoration, it was a prophecy. As Caesar moved through his late teens and into his 20th year, his military career gave him more than discipline and courage. It gave him connections, education, and a deeper understanding of how power actually worked beyond Rome's marble facades. Asia Minor was not merely a battlefield, it was a crossroads of cultures, kings, merchants, philosophers, and political opportunists. And Caesar, with his sharp eyes and sharper ambition, absorbed everything around him like a thirsty sponge. Whenever the army paused in a wealthy coastal city, Caesar drifted toward its elites. He dined with Greek magistrates, observed debates in local councils, listened to philosophers argue beneath porticos, and studied how charismatic leaders shaped opinions without ever drawing a sword. In maze rooms, Caesar learned that true power didn't always rule. Sometimes it whispered, questioned, charmed, and persuaded. These were skills that would one day let him dominate the Roman Senate. Without lifting a finger, his natural charm blossomed. Even as a young man, he had what later biographers called desuae vitas, a blend of elegance, eloquence, and warmth. He remembered names, asked thoughtful questions, and laughed easily. People liked him. More importantly, they trusted him. Officers began sending him as a representative to allied rulers because he was respectful but not submissive, confident but not arrogant, diplomatic without being dull. Caesar learned to adjust his personality like a weapon, soft when needed, sharp when required. He also polished his Greek, the language of the educated East. Scholars recalled him practicing speeches in the evenings, shaping his rhetoric long before his first real public address in Rome. Even in exile, he prepared for the life he believed destiny owed him. But Asia Minor also introduced him to a darker lesson. Politics was a game of masks. He watched alliances from over wine one night and collapse at dawn. He saw commanders flatter kings while secretly plotting against them. He noticed how a single rumor could change a man's fate. These observations etched themselves into Caesar's teenage mind. He learned never to trust appearances, never to show his full intentions, and never to underestimate the power of perception. Caesar entered Asia Minor as a fugitive trying to survive. He was now becoming something more dangerous, a young man learning to influence minds, win hearts, and navigate political landscapes with the ease of a future ruler. The sword had taught him courage. Society was teaching him control. By the time Caesar reached his early 22nd, news began drifting into the eastern camps like cautious messengers. Sulla was dying. The dictator who had chased Caesar from Rome, executed hundreds, exiled thousands, and ruled with an iron fist now weakened by illness, withdrawing into his villa in Campa. For Caesar, this rumor was more than gossip. It was a signal. The city that had once been a death trap was beginning to loosen its grip. When Sulla finally died in 78 BC, Caesar felt the world shift beneath him. The fear that had shadowed his adolescence didn't disappear, but it softened into something manageable. Powerful men who had once avoided him now reached out quietly. Old family friends sent letters, suggesting it might be safe to come home. Even officers in Asia Minor hinted that a young man of his talent shouldn't waste his life on distant garrisons forever. So Caesar prepared for the journey west, not as a boy running from danger, but as a young man returning with new scars, new skills, and a new sense of purpose. The road back to Italy mirrored his exile in reverse. But everything felt different now. He walked into Greek cities and understood their politics. He rode through mountain passes with a soldier's instincts. He carried himself with a confidence he had not possessed when he first left Rome. Even the men who traveled with him sensed the change. Caesar no longer looked like someone avoiding fate. He looked like someone approaching it. As he crossed the Adriatic Sea and glimpsed the Italian coastline, Caesar felt something complicated rise in his chest. Relief, pride, and a flicker of vengeance all intertwined. Rome had cast him out. Rome had tried to break him. But here he was, returning stronger than before, sharpened by hardship and carrying honors earned not through family privilege, but through blood and bravery. He entered the city quietly, without parade or announcement. Rome was still dangerous, still factional, still scarred by civil war, but it was no longer ruled by a man who wanted him dead. Caesar visited relatives, reconnected with his mother, Aurelia, and walked through the streets he had once feared losing forever. Yet something in him had changed irrevocably. He saw Rome's corruption more clearly. He understood its weaknesses. He sensed how easily its leaders could be manipulated by fear, charm, spectacle, or ambition. Caesar had left Rome as a hunted teenager. He returned as a man who understood power, both its dangers and its possibilities. And Rome unknowingly had just welcomed home its future conqueror. Caesar's return to Rome did not immediately place him in the spotlight. He was still young, still relatively unknown, and still recovering from years spent as an outlaw turned soldier. But inside him, something had crystallized. The hardships of exile, the dangers of Sulla H's regime, the discipline of military life, the lessons of diplomacy, all of it fused into a new identity. Caesar was no longer merely a noble youth of ancient lineage. He was a man building himself from the ground up. Rome, however, hadn't changed as much as he had hoped. The Republic was fractured, riddled with resentments left over from the civil wars. Veterans loyal to Sulla H dominated politics. Senators whispered behind closed doors, fearful of new uprisings. Corruption seeped through the courts, and ambition poisoned every conversation. Caesar recognized the cracks instantly. The city was unstable, vulnerable even, and for the first time he began to imagine not how he might survive Rome, but how he might shape it. But ambition alone wasn't enough. Caesar needed influence, training, and visibility. So he turned to what he had always understood best, rhetoric. Though still in his early 22nd, he began practicing law as an advocate, honing his voice until it could slice through a crowd as cleanly as a blade. He took on cases others avoided: corrupt governors, mistreated allies, victims of political abuse. Romans began to notice his fire, his fearlessness, his refusal to bow to the powerful. These early speeches were risky, even reckless. The men he attacked were wealthy, connected, and vicious. But Caesar had learned courage in the mountains of Asia Minor. Standing before hostile juries didn't compare to charging through enemy spears. Rome's political dangers felt manageable compared to real war. At the same time, Caesar invested in alliances, small ones at first. He befriended young politicians like himself, men disillusioned with the Senate's sating aristocracy. He joined intellectual circles, attended lavish banquets, charmed influential matrons, and did what he always excelled at: winning hearts. Every handshake mattered, every conversation planted seeds, every appearance built the image of a rising star who had survived tyranny without becoming timid. And beneath it all, he carried Sully H's bitter prophecy: "In this Caesar, there are many Mari users." Caesar didn't forget those words. He embraced them. His teenage years had begun with fear, loss, and flight. They ended with confidence, purpose, and an emerging vision of what Rome could become under his rule. The boy who escaped the dictator would not run